Hello. Suppose you had a lot of these and you weren't going back to school, but rather you had a lot of these notebooks, index cards, and so on filled with notes, which, in the inspiration of a moment or few, you had written down. Suppose, moreover, that maybe like a hoarder or like a squirrel preparing for some winter or maybe some years of leisure, you would go through these notebooks, maybe there are 20 of them or 40, filled with your own thoughts over maybe a period of a decade or even more. Now, suppose you had done that. You hadn't converted your method to digital notes first. You didn't think, oh, well, I'll just gather the data in text files or PDFs and eventually wait for the rise of ChatGPT, Claude, and others from the year 2022 onward to assist me in summarizing and analyzing these texts. So suppose that's you. Suppose that even if you're interested in leveraging the new LLM technology for analysis of your own sentences in natural language, such as English, or whatever language you prefer to speak, maybe Latin, maybe an ancient language too, you nonetheless, anyway, did not initially wholly buy into the implicit digital preference. What if my files in the cloud are lost? For example, what if Google or some other institution shuts down my account? Then all my files are lost, or my hard drive fails for whatever reason. Granted, paper documents could perish in a fire, but maybe that's more rare than a digital failure. Who knows? It depends on what the insurance companies would say about that, as they have the statistics and so on. Now that in brief is the problem. You have a gross accumulation of analog notes, and you could go through them, just as you could go through digital notes, reviewing them. Perhaps you would employ spaced repetition to that end. Maybe you would not only just reread them as you reviewed them, but excerpt quotes which are great thoughts or they're bad but very representative of the time of the notebook. For example, let's say this notebook is from, a few months in the year 2017. So you want to not only summarize, but extract some gold nuggets. The process of review is also a mining for value from these literary events that stream from your brain onto the page. So to recap, the problem isn't only an excess of notes, whether analog or digital, but the problem of not just interpreting them or making sense of them, but also extracting some value. What do these lost decades buy me when my focus was so much on philosophical problems? Maybe you were fool enough to try to refute cause and effect, or maybe you dabbled in metaphysics and tried to rebuild the cosmos. Maybe even tap into some magical powers. The problems can be absurd, but the intellectual, the proposed solutions to the problem maybe can be absurd, but sometimes you build out intellectual middleware that is of interest, but not just of interest, but I think of value. Value not in any sense, not in any traditional religious sense, but value that's truly attached to even the purchasing power of currencies like dollars and euros. You might ultimately, by extracting some patterns from your own notes, say, hey, I had this pattern and it was good, or I had another pattern that was actually deleterious to my intellectual development. It was a hidden assumption, and lo and behold, I see it in my civilization that surrounds me at large, so I can inform other people about this deleterious assumption or pattern. Just as I can propose that I have a good schema, and maybe it will be useful. Maybe it will be useful for big changes in science and technology. Now that sounds very untraditional, but realistically, if you have two countries and one of them focuses on science and technology, it's soulless, and the other focuses on tradition. Oh, how soulful. In the event of any disagreement, be it economic or trade, which one is ultimately going to win? So arguably, you, yourself, and the whole group of human beings, a subgroup with whom you associate, has some balance, perhaps, of science and technical interests, while it still mines whatever value might be left to extract from more traditional human endeavors. Dare I say, philosophy is one of those. So a subproblem of the great buildup of notes that you've been hoarding, and maybe you've converted them to digital files on Amazon's S3, kind of a cloud storage platform, mostly for software developers and enterprise companies. It's pretty reliable, and it's also pretty cheap. So that goes to the question that, well, what if a fire happens and I lose the notebook? But I think we digressed a bit. S3 is probably safer from an insurance company's point of view than a paper document, which could be stolen or perish in flames. But recovering from this unnecessary digression, we should cast in doubt the value of philosophy at all. One of the great philosophical problems that we should focus on is whether it's completely pointless to pursue. Maybe we should be out and out capitalists, if in any philosophical statement. We've read Nietzsche, for example. We've heard about the will to power. Are we actually pursuing power by philosophy, or are we just contradicting ourselves? And I don't have a great answer right now. It could be that philosophy, it's just a medical pathology. Even if you're an atheist, it's a residual form of payments to some deity that you think in this way in natural language. And what's the use? Is there any immediate scientific improvement? Am I going to achieve insights in chemistry, for example? Or am I going to achieve new computational technology? Is anything that I think or say useful for AI or even quantum computing? Maybe not. So that's the kind of trying to recover from this. We want to put philosophy on the chopping block. We want to detect if we're merely doing it to pay undiagnosed spiritual debts, which are ultimately kind of absurd. They don't benefit us unless we implicitly believe in some life after death. And then it's just like, the religious model where you pray and you count your prayers and so on, as you would count sheep or cattle sacrificed as a literal 10% tithe. It's the kind of religious model which is ignorant of the concept of faith, of course, and rebirth, and changing how you know, think, judge, and so on, if not also a complete bodily rebirth, completely. So we want to put philosophy in doubt. If I have 20 years of accumulated notebooks and I can't even make sense of it, maybe I've been wasting my time. Maybe I am just a neurotic on a fool's errand. Maybe it's the boring contemporary version of Don Quixote. It's less interesting than swinging a windmill. You're still taking the pen and you're writing thoughts on the page. Oh, it must be good if I had a sharp intake of breath. It made me happy, so it must be good, right? Oh, I like it, so it's good. It's going to benefit me. Maybe not. Maybe your physiological response to the neurological event is completely unfounded, and you need to unlearn it. But enough skepticism. What do we really doubt? We're just posing as skeptics to enrage the crowd or to alienate potential disciples. This is our way of following along with Nietzsche's admonishment to any potential disciples and to future philosophers to beware discipleship. So we have this problem. So that's kind of the groundwork. That's kind of the pain point that the method of interpretation that I want to propose addresses. It's kind of a solution to that pain point, as though we were diagnosing some pain or disease, and we thought of a medicine or a pill. Whether you believe in medicine as drugs or not, when drugs are necessary, it's just, forgive me, it's just a metaphor. Now, all that said, what is common to any note that you would write down in a notebook? It's a sentence, let's say it's in English, it's a sentence or several that express some notion, typically without declaring the occasion or the, context of the note. It's obvious to the writer why it's said and what it's connected to. The relations to other notes aren't made explicit. So you're only exposed to the chronology as you review these notebooks. Or maybe the note leaves some clues in the nouns that it openly says. In the nouns, since nouns are the most childish form of speech, as you notice a child's passion to name things. A child might see a car, for example, an ancient car with peculiar wheels, and say, bike. It's a joy of naming and identifying things, and these nouns are names, which in elementary school you may have learned that a noun is a person, a place, or a thing, besides philosophically an abstract thing, if not maybe an abstract realm or an abundance like wealth. What is wealth? What is a bank account? Also, it's more complex with the relation between you and an institution. It's also like a ledger, and that it's the sum. It keeps track of the sum of your transactions, such as deposits and withdrawals, which are events. So it's much less obvious than this. So this is a pen, obviously, than things at hand. The pen, of course, is some kind of tool. The paper. You can see these things. And if you don't know whether a noun is a person, place, or thing, we'll finish the digression in a second. But it could also just be a name. You don't necessarily have to eagerly categorize it. Anyway, it'd be hard to disagree with the premise that nouns show up in sentences, whether they're philosophical or not. What are we talking about? We're talking about sentences, and maybe also a subclass of sentences, such as philosophical sentences, which are mostly what notes claim to be. Inspired philosophical sentences, if not analysis downstream from a kind of primitive accumulation of juvenile or childish, perhaps, insights. And before we focus too much on the nouns, I do want to admit that other parts of speech, such as the verbs and different ways of knowing could resolve into seeing, which is one form of knowing. It considers mostly the present moment, temporally speaking, and any objects like, this jar in front of me, or the phone on which I'm recording this video. So seeing doesn't really keep in mind multiple scenes or multiple documents at different times with divergences in thought, especially undetected divergences or undetected similarities if you have 20 notebooks. So you might find that you're repeating yourself where you think you're innovating, or you believe you have continuity, where you actually have a deep contradiction that might be more beneficial to you if it were brought to light. So in a method of analysis, a kind of interpretation of notes should reveal agreements and disagreements between the notes over time. And just that? Well, there's so much that could be said, but in such a short video. And because we had begun this discussion of interpretation of notes by talking about the nouns, falling back on the saying of nouns as a kind of bedrock of certainty, that important nouns will occur, and they will recur in your notes. And sometimes also you'll be composing thoughts, or thoughts will come to you. It's almost passive in the natural language that you speak, that sometimes that may or may not also use the key nouns in the language, or at least the language as it's contemporarily spoken. And the language as it's contemporarily spoken may have multiple key classes of nouns that almost contend with each other for supremacy, or to be the more valuable, to overpower the other, if you wanted to paraphrase this with Hegelian or Nietzschean syntax. Because I do think that this is mostly what's going on. So an interpretation of your own notes is a way to assemble a almost miniature model that nonetheless you can hold up to history at large as a kind of microscope or telescope to discern the historical meteorological patterns that are ultimately happening, and to not just predict the meteorology or the weather to come in the future, but also to detect something that hasn't been done yet and to do it yourself that is nonetheless logically in accord with a model. So there are historical and not just prophetic. I don't care about prophecy. If you can innovate, that would be better. Why predict something when you can just do it? And to digress a little bit, and to appreciate but also criticize the great Ray Dalio, his modus operandi is always predicting the next storm or the crisis, a big debt crisis, before it happens. Now, philosophically, and maybe in a more audacious Nietzschean manner, I would ask this kind of thinker which is better, to simply prepare for the next crisis, the next winter or adverse event, some political event or a black swan economic event, to simply prepare for that, for this unpredictable, according to their models, monstrosity. Or if we were more daringly Nietzschean, wouldn't we want to just be the monster that everyone else has to address? The crisis. Wouldn't you want to just be the crisis to which everyone else is affected has to respond? Maybe, but assuming a military imbalance, it might lead to your physical destruction. So, of course, be careful. Be careful in that regard. But intellectually, if you could be the monster, now, I think that would be pretty cool. But to start on that dubious metamorphosis, we'd have to go back to the discussion of interpretation of notes. So you've already wasted 2 decades of your life taking notes on paper. You've digitized some of them because you derive some benefit from discourse with AI. The LLM is sometimes much more useful than a human interlocutor. You can type quickly, and in the way that you understand it, it will sanitize, normalize your input so that if you wanted, they might be presentable to normies. And it even suggested itself that with an idiosyncratic thinker, that a dialogue might be a more effective format than simply a book written in prose, or even a video like this. You tell me, would it be helpful, for example, if ChatGPT offered, I guess, I'm not sure if it'd be color commentary or play-by-play. Ideally, the single interlocutor in a kind of YouTube soliloquy would play both roles, would go, but I think the play-by-play is really for the normies part. Most of this is just the color commentator going deeper and deeper, maybe into rabbit holes, maybe not, maybe detecting the gleam of some diamond in the rough and engineering a process to extract that from the mine of personal intellectual history. Who knows the format? But this, anyway, is intended to be a kind of prelude to the forthcoming book, Interpretation of Notes. And do you know what the Latin is for that? Interpretatio notarum. It's easier to sing it, to give yourself some extra motivation, because it's really like a scroll, but it's contemporary. And you'll see that the notes in your notebooks reuse nouns, and they may or may not reuse some of the primary, at least per one category, of nouns in your natural language. So we're not necessarily immediately even paying attention to the exact notions that are said as sentences and doing justice to them. And I'm not even sure that, honestly, it actually matters. So we might not even need to know what the individual thinker says, because, for example, if he's saying things like the world or the universe, and I think you're familiar with this anti-astronomical, not just anti-astronomical pattern of mind, but it's intended to call into question the supremacy of the interrogative category of nouns. Where? We can just name it where. Nouns like realm, country, but also universe, region especially, are very easily categorizable as where. And to assume in your speech without any explicit experience, because experience is plural. And I'm not going to say, oh, you've never seen the whole universe in perception, and because you haven't seen it in perception, therefore you don't really know it. I'm saying something a bit removed, or a bit before that, or prior metaphysically to that. I'm questioning whether perception is the most useful form of knowing for confronting all problems and in relation to all goals. Perception, mostly seeing, or whether another form of knowing, such as interpretation, is ultimately more useful, whether it's literary analysis. We don't care so much about that. but for example, data analysis and extraction of patterns, not just price shifts, but sovereign events with currency, interest rates, and so on. But hand waving and vague, but the kind of analysis of events which have some hard data, even if it's shadowy, that hedge funds would do. You could go back and say, well, this is similar to what Ray Dalio does as well. And there's a great reason why we bring in this basic, superficial description of what a hedge fund would do, what maybe a quant hedge fund would do, something which Ray Dalio had pioneered in his time. There's a reason why we're bringing this to bear on a seemingly merely philosophical concept, and the nouns that you write down and that you say that come to you and in the spontaneous thoughts, each thought is like a reaffirmation or a reevaluation of the value of the nouns that you say, much like the price ticker on April 16th, 1984 of Acme stock or whatever. This price ticker, it's a kind of event. It expresses the instant market value of this company at this time for whatever reason. Now, we're not only saying which nouns we value or the values of the civilization at large that we directly or tacitly, unconsciously maybe, accept, but also because there's so many nouns, AI would be fine if there were, thousands of nouns or tens of thousands floating around. It wouldn't be that hard to price them, not just based on frequency, but based on the extent to which this noun for the astronomical physicist type, like world, even a common herd logic, which would want to doubt philosophical thinking by positioning it in your head, by incapitating, not decapitating, but by incapitation. Why? As a mode of devaluation of the thoughts, saying that they have no implication and thus no value. They can't be premises or intermediate steps in the building of any system to achieve effects, ultimately do work, or increase the amount of work that can be done for whatever reason, vaguely speaking, to increase GDP at whatever level. So they're incapitated. And what a common thinker would say to you in that situation is, well, what about the world? What about the world? Well, which one? The concept that's commonly held to be singular as well. So we don't just pay attention to the interrogative category of the noun, but also how it's commonly invoked numerically, singularly, plurally. And this could be done with no article at all. Universe, so in English you say the universe. I'm trying to think, for some reason I'm at a loss, but God is the obvious one. So there are also theological, historical implications. You could assume probably that God was at one point, or the gods, right, were the most important noun or family of nouns invoked in language. But I say important, it's the most valuable. Those that are most constitutive towards the forming of effective notions. And you can see that, in your own notes. In my case, it's a case of consent or dissent from some fundamental astronomical model, some assent some assent, collaboration, or then violent disagreement with the notion that where is the most important interrogative category. And you can find dissent from that if you read more ancient texts, which are more interested in species, great chain of being, classification of animals, such as birds, fish, and so on, that are more so focused on the distinctions between things rather than aggressively trying to achieve homogeneity and reduction to mostly egalitarian building blocks within some all where, like a mathematical Cartesian coordinate system, for example. Well, I think we've gotten pretty far afield of the plan for this video. Maybe it would help to not just talk about the relative values of the nouns. One way, frequency may express the value of a noun, such as world or universe, or the context. The thinker is always falling back to saying, well, and in this context, I don't have enough context for this. So it could be frequency, especially a neurotic frequency of an either undefined or supposed to be commonly understood noun. But it could also just be the mode of invocation. It's always singular. It's always definite. So it's part of a communal conscience. It's operating at a level of morality that's so primitive that you don't even feel remorse or guilt openly, even if that's a Freudian statement. Yes, I'm going to make it that preference for some realm as opposed to, say, a species or an individual, what or who, different interrogative categories, or even as opposed to a focus on wealth, for example, how much. So if you're trying to build wealth, but your mental focus your mental scaffolding is primarily astronomical, you might encounter some headwinds on that journey towards growth. Well, growth of what? Growth of assets, health, wealth, true happiness, based on freedom, not fictions, lies, or other things. Yeah. So I'm just gonna. I know it's been way too long, but I'm gonna try to reach a conclusion. So you have too much of these, and somehow you discover a method of interpretation. You realize that each of these notes are like price signals, or like price tickers. So each of them might not be that important or that valuable, but you're going to see patterns anyway over time where you don't just doubt whether, world or universe, maybe it's not singular, maybe it's plural. We don't care about that. What we care about is the value of the category where of nouns, and we want to call that into question or deprecate it. Now, why would we call it into question? Well, because modern civilization, from the time of Descartes and maybe even before onwards, through Newton, physics before modern physics, and so on, has mostly been predicated on this strategy of allocation of value, whatever that value means, of how much, to different interrogative categories of nouns. It's almost at a neurological, or dare I say spiritual level, that is upstream perhaps from the saying. It's prior, it's logically, metaphysically, whatever, spiritually, neurologically, prior to all the saying of sentences for the most part, but it can expose itself to the saying of the sentences, so you can catch it having exposed itself in the open, and thus you can re-engineer it, perhaps. And that's the whole point. Ancient civilization was predicated upon the supremacy, highest value, allocated to the interrogative category, what. Hence, exercise for the reader, but maybe Plato's ideas or Aristotle's substance have something to do with the interrogative strategy, so we call it, or allocation of most value. And what is what, if we may ask what, is this kind of value, this primordial how muchness, which is either spread evenly across the categories, because different kinds of questions, we haven't even gone into that, but who, what, where, when, temporally speaking, but also whence, where, and whither. You notice the modern English tends to collapse whence, where, and whither into just one uber question, which again erases distinctions. That's modern egalitarianism, whereas the ancient, more vertically noble, but also respecting horizontal distinctions as well. How did Caesar, for example, open the war in Gaul? Didn't he say something like, omnis Gallia est divisa in partes tres? So all Gaul is divided into 3 parts. And he talks about the different tribes, customs, and institutions. This is what he wants. It's not just a silly tripartite structure. He wants to notice the distinctions, not asking, how can I compress them into one uniform Gaul? Except by conquering it, of course. But that's another matter. So, going back, we haven't even gone over any individual notes. And the problem is that what I have to say is a bit too obvious to me. And yet, as you can detect, that this 5-minute video is spilled over into 36, that nonetheless, I'm still at the point where I have too much to say. So anyway, what I think is that there are 2 possible alternative interrogative strategies that haven't been tried in Western civilization, or just any civilization, or collective human unit with some resemblant neurology. So if ancient was predicated on the highest value of where, and modern, these are just temporal adjectives, but bear with me, was predicated upon the highest value of where. Now, ancient was on what? I said modern was on where. What revaluation of all values, or evaluable things, or nouns, should we attempt? So the simple one that's in concert with American self-help and entrepreneurship and capitalism, even with Marxism, if you just take Marx as a critic and you don't follow the political model towards communism, even if as a politician you might consider communism to ultimately empower your country, the strategic wealth redistribution. I know, but actually, it's really the opposite of what the Chinese Communist Party does with some permitted capitalism. They're not necessarily married to any individual economic ideology. It's almost another thesis, another video. Maybe it's almost become somewhat nationalist, and maybe even don't want to say the word fascist, but maybe it's the leveraging of economic models. And changing them depending on the situation and the goal, the problem and the goal. What are you trying to accomplish? So customizing that towards the individual situation. But if we wanted to attempt some kind of revaluation of values, I would say, because we're already talking about value anyway, it's of the category how much. We're talking about importance, significance, one being supreme over the other, that it would seem to me that how much might be logically the most important interrogative, not only the most important interrogative category, but saying this as a declaration is that henceforth let how much be most important interrogative category. Let us speak in the way that the nouns we invoke singly and definitely are of this category how much. But it sounds cheesy, man. It's just wealth and abundance. And Tony Robbins or T. Harv Eker, they've Ecker, they've already exhausted this space, so there might not be much useful fecundity in this regard remaining. So the more cautious approach might just be to say, well, just speak negatively and say we shouldn't be overweight. Let's say you're talking stocks or equity versus fixed income. You have a portfolio, you decide you're 60-40, you're 75-25. You're allocating value towards some objective, whether it's wealth maximization, retirement, or whatever. Maybe for some advisors, income is also an investment objective as well. So, and in a customized model, maybe you follow the index. You're doing direct indexing, so you're just following the weights of the given to you by the S&P 500, and maybe you have your own preference. For example, maybe you want to be overweight in technology, or maybe you prefer value, so you're going to invest in railroads for whatever reason, because Warren Buffett did it and he beat the market for various reasons. So, and anyway, digressions within digressions within digressions, and so on. When we're talking about distributions, we might consider not only resisting an ancient versus modern, or an Apollinian Spengler, Apollinish Spengler said, or Faustian bias in favor of species or realm as nature. So what and where. Maybe we want to oppose both of those, not necessarily unconditionally marry the importance of how much. Although it's nice to talk about health as an abundance and wealth as an abundance. And if only I could increase my wealth just by increasing my health, because my inner world creates my outer world. I create my life, or whatever, as Ecker writes, and excusing the silly invocation of the banned noun world. A uniform distribution, just being developed in each mental, cognitive, interrogative area of nominal noun, rather, invocation of the natural language in which you happen to speak. So realigning the categories of nouns that you invoke with some ancient respect, maybe Latin-like respect for distinctions between the categories, might actually be needful. So, for example, would you ask a bodybuilder, well, what's your most important part? You might be Arnold, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger might be naturally gifted in the chest, by the biceps, but he wouldn't say, oh, well, because I'm gifted here, I'm going to expect outsized returns or big victories in Mr. Olympia by exaggerating my natural strengths. You might also want to shore up the legs, the calves, the hamstrings, and so on. It's just an analogy, but the question is, well, is a third kind of bias for a different category of noun to let it scaffold, not just scaffold our notions, the sentences that come to us, but these are also going to have big physical implications, because if you were to revalue all values, or just a few evaluables in this way, it's going to have implications for physics as well. Now, did I say at some point that simply a uniform distribution might be good enough, because then you bring back online whence and whether, which were said more frequently in Elizabethan and English up to through the 19th century, but have come, again, maybe as part of the egalitarian push for erasure of distinctions. Maybe it's all part of that, not just political, but also that kind of mental whatever mentality. We'll just say it's an effect. It's an effect of that mentality. So different mentalities, different interrogative biases have different downstream effects, even if they play out over decades or centuries. At least allowing natural historical evolution. The other implication is that if a chosen interrogatively biased portfolio were to have protracted civilizational effects, if unmanaged for a millennium, how could you yourself, whether in isolation or with other individuals, realize the fruits of those foundations, the inevitable fruits of those roots, within a manageable time for a lifetime? And yeah, perhaps LLMs would assist in that evolution. We would want LLMs to be aware of these linguistic and philosophically and linguistic divergences we want to introduce, so they're not just machine learning English that's spoken today and thus actually hardening the entire interrogative constitution, which is with its what ChatGPT also calls whereism. When it is he, she, more aware of the conversation. When, however, repeated correction is usually required to keep even the best of LLMs on track in this regard. Now, in this already extremely longish video, do we want to talk further about the potential physical implications? This could already be a way of reorganizing artificial intelligence with more managed rather than unmanaged trainings. If we think about the weights of the interrogative categories, and then the weights that the values, that the nouns are going to inherit from their, because they're part of a family, so to speak. It could have impact there. And I think I'll leave it at that, because if I were to go into the implication for physics, I feel like, in spite of this somewhat more clear intellectual milieu that I inhabit, that's spatial, unfortunately, metaphor that to talk about physics, I would have to achieve another warm-up and a ramp-up towards that direction, because even in my case, in spite of what I'm saying, you have to unbind certain assumptions, which, even if to you as an individual alone, they're not religiously held, they're not that tight. As soon as you enter into any social situation, you might find yourself frozen or fretful of offending the herd. And that's why we'll leave it at that. So we're introducing a forthcoming book. There's no timetable, but maybe I would say monthly, we could have updates on what on earth is going on and being composed, and how it's coming towards clarity and really some kind of outline. It's called interpretation of notes, not just because the analysis to be presented arose from going through my own notebooks in the past 20 years, but also because the kind of strategy, allocation of value that you detect that you're doing, it suggests the more active management of even history and own thoughts that could come forth to potentially question which is more important, motion or space, light or law. Wale.